The water was a beast. It roared with a fury that drowned out the thunder, splitting the bruised sky, its icy teeth chewing at the banks of the Verde River. Alara's muscles screamed a chorus of fire against the frigid onslaught. The weight of the man on her back was a dead thing, an anchor determined to drag them both into the churning, muddy depths. Splintered timbers from the washed-out bridge cartwheeled past them in the torrent ghost limbs of a crossing that no longer existed. She was not a strong woman, not in the way of men who boasted of their brawn. Her strength was a thing of sinew and sheer, unyielding will, forged in the crucible of solitude and loss. She dug her worn boots into the slick mud of the riverbank, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged, burning gasps. One more heave. Her body shuddered, a machine pushed beyond its limits. With a final desperate surge, she hauled the man's limp form from the river's grasp, collapsing beside him on the relative safety of the shore. Rain lashed down cold and sharp, plastering her dark hair to her face and turning the red earth to soup. For a long moment, she lay there, the world, a dizzying spin of gray sky and brown water. The man was Apache. His dark, wet hair was matted with blood from a gash on his temple, and his deerskin tunic was torn, revealing a deep, ugly wound in his side. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, a fragile flutter in his chest. Survival instincts honed over years of living alone screamed at her. Leave him. He was trouble. An Apache wounded, and this close to the town of redemption, was a death sentence for him, and likely for anyone who helped him. The townsfolk saw the world in black and white, and he was the deepest shade of black. She started to push herself up, to turn away, to let the wilderness claim what was its own. But her hand, numb and clumsy, brushed against something hard, tucked into the deerskin pouch at his belt. Curiosity, a foolish and dangerous impulse, made her pause. Her fingers fumbled with the wet leather tie and drew out the object. It was a small bird carved from a piece of pale cottonwood. It was no bigger than her thumb, its lines simple but certain. A songbird, its head cocked as if listening for a melody only it could hear. And the world stopped. The roar of the river faded. The sting of the rain vanished. In its place, she heard the faint, ghostly echo of a child's laughter and the gentle scrape of a knife on wood. See, Ellie, I'm making him a friend so he won't be lonely when he flies south. The memory was so vivid, it was a physical blow. Her brother Ethan, all of 7 years old, sitting on the porch steps of their ranch house. The sun was warm on his face, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the present. In his small, capable hands, he held a piece of cottonwood and his father's whittling knife. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he carved the exact same bird. An identical twin to the one she now held in her trembling palm. He had given it away, he told her later, to a new friend he'd made down by the creek. An Apache boy. A secret friendship, innocent and pure, in a world that would never have understood it. A week later, the world had burned. The raid, the screams, the smell of smoke and fear, the image of her father falling her mother's last cry. And Ethan, gone. All of it blamed on the Apache. A massacre that had carved her life in two, leaving her the sole survivor, a ghost haunting the land that had once been her home. She stared at the carved bird, then at the unconscious man at her feet. This wasn't a stranger. He was a connection, a living thread, back to a time before the silence, before the ghosts. He was the last piece of her brother's kindness in a world that had shown her none. The instinct to flee died, replaced by a fierce protective resolve that was as sudden and powerful as the flash flood that had nearly killed them both. The town could hate her. The world could condemn her. It wouldn't be the first time. She looked down at the Apache warrior, his face serene in its unconscious state. "I'll never leave you." She whispered the words of promise, not just to him, but to the ghost of a 7-year-old boy. It was a promise that would cost her everything, a promise that would force her to confront the very memory that had tried to bury her alive. She didn't know it yet, but in saving this man, she was taking the first step towards saving herself. Carefully, she slipped the bird back into its pouch, secured the tie, and began the impossible task of getting him home. The journey back to the ranch was a trial of endurance. Alara half-dragged, half-carried the wounded man, her every step a testament to a will that refused to break. The red mud sucked at her boots, trying to claim her, while the wind howled through the canyons, a mournful song for the dead and the dying. Her ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a fortress of solitude built by her father's hands. The log house was sturdy, the barn weathered but strong, and the land around it was a patchwork of struggling pasture and unforgiving rock. It was a lonely place, buffered from the world by a ring of skeletal mesas that clawed at the sky. For 10 years this land had been her sanctuary, and her prison a constant aching reminder of everything she had lost. Inside, the air was still and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. She laid the man on her own narrow bed, the coarseness of the wool blanket a stark contrast to his cold skin. Working by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, she tended to his wounds with a practiced hand. The gash on his head was shallow, but the injury in his side was deep, the flesh torn and angry. She cleaned it with boiled water and whiskey, her touch gentle but efficient, her face a mask of concentration. He never stirred, lost in a place beyond pain. As she stitched the wound closed with a fine needle and gut, her mind raced. The bird was an impossibility, a miracle she couldn't explain. It had to be the same one. The small, uneven notch on the underside of the tail where Ethan's knife had slipped, it was there. This man, Cale, as she would learn he was called, was the boy from the creek. The boy her brother had called a friend. How could this be? How could fate be so cruel and so kind all at once? The following days bled into one another, a cycle of tending the fire boiling water and watching Cale's chest rise and fall. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about the ranch, about the stubbornness of the soil, about anything other than the fire that had consumed her past. It was more for her own comfort than his, a way to fill the oppressive silence that had been her only companion for a decade. On the third day, redemption came to her. Not in the form of a welcoming party, but as Silas Croft mounted on a magnificent black stallion that seemed to scorn the very ground it walked on. Croft was the town's patriarch, its benefactor, its shadow king. He had arrived a few months after the massacre, a man of wealth and vision who promised progress. He built the new general store, funded the sheriff's office, and spoke of a future where the railroad would turn their dusty outpost into a thriving city. He was handsome, his words as smooth as polished river stones, but his eyes held the cold, calculating glint of a predator. He had been pressuring her for months to sell her land. It was, he claimed, the only viable route for the coming railroad tracks. Alara, he said, his voice a rich baritone that carried easily in the still air. He dismounted his expensive leather boots, making no sound on the packed earth. A pleasure as always. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect that felt like a calculated insult. Croft, she replied, her voice flat. She stood on her porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. It wasn't a threat, merely a fact of her existence. I've come with a final offer, he said, getting straight to the point. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were fixed on her land, devouring it. A generous one. Enough to set you up in a fine house in Prescott or even back east. A woman like you shouldn't be out here alone scratching a living from this unforgiving dust. His condescension was a familiar sting. He saw a broken woman, a fragile relic. He didn't see the steel beneath the surface. This land is not for sale, she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. It was my father's. Croft's smile tightened. Your father was a good man, but he was a dreamer. I am a man of action, of progress. The railroad is coming, Alara. It is an inevitability. This valley will be part of that future, with or without you standing on it. The veiled threat hung in the air between them, as sharp and cold as a winter morning. He named a figure, a staggering sum that could buy a dozen ranches like hers. It wasn't about the money. It was about the headstones on the hill overlooking the house. It was about the ghost of a little boy's laughter on the porch. The answer is no, she said. For a fleeting second, the mask of civility slipped. A flicker of pure cold fury crossed his face, before being replaced by a look of paternal disappointment. He looked past her toward the house, and his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A trick of the light, or had he seen something? A shadow moving past the window. Have it your way, he said, his voice once again smooth as silk. But do reconsider. A lone woman makes for an easy target. The world is full of dangers. He mounted his horse, gave her a final lingering look, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. The battle line had been drawn. She stood on her porch, clutching the shotgun, and watched him go, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew his visit wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about control, and she was in his way. That night, Kyle's fever broke. He woke with a gasp, his dark eyes wide, and filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. He tried to rise, his hand instinctively going to the empty sheath at his belt. Easy, Alara said softly, holding up her hands to show she was unarmed. You're safe here. His eyes darted around the small, unfamiliar room, finally landing on her face. Suspicion warred with pain and confusion in his gaze. He didn't speak, but the question was clear. Why? She didn't have the words to explain the carved bird, the ghost of her brother, the sudden, inexplicable duty she felt. Instead, she offered him a ladle of water. He watched her for a long moment, his jaw tight, before finally accepting it, his thirst overriding his mistrust. He drank greedily, the first small truce in an unspoken war. The world outside her valley remained blissfully unaware of the guest in her home. But such secrets were impossible to keep in a place as small and watchful as Redemption. Jedediah Hicks, a grizzled prospector, whose claim bordered her land to the north, was tracking a mountain lion that had been harassing his mules. His path took him along the ridge overlooking Alara's ranch. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and scanned the valley below. That's when he saw it. A figure dark-skinned and clad in deerskin, moving slowly near Alara's barn, leaning on the fence for support. Jedediah wasn't a malicious man, but he was a gossip, and fear was the most valuable currency in town. By the time he rode into Redemption, the story had grown talons and fangs. The lone Cimarron woman wasn't just alone anymore. She was harboring an Apache, a warrior. The news spread through the town like a prairie fire. It ignited old fears, memories of the Cimarron massacre that Silas Croft had so expertly used to cement his position as the town's protector. In the dusty saloon, men who had known Alara's father shook their heads in disbelief. Has she lost her mind? One muttered into his beer. To take in one of the very savages that killed her kin. Croft, of course, fanned the flames with practiced ease. He didn't shout or make accusations. He simply expressed his deep concern for Alara's safety and well-being. The poor woman, he'd say, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Grief can do terrible things to the mind. She's vulnerable. We must protect her and ourselves from her clouded judgment. The town's fear soon curdled into anger. The whispers that had once followed Alara, pitying her, isolating her now, became openly hostile. She was no longer just the strange woman from the Cimarron place. She was a traitor. The burden of delivering this verdict fell to Sheriff Brody. He was a man caught between his duty and his conscience. He was older, his face a roadmap of long years under the Arizona sun, and he remembered Alara as a bright, happy girl before the fire had stolen the light from her eyes. He owed his position to Croft's funding, a fact that sat uneasily with him. But he'd also been a friend of Alara's father. He rode out to her ranch, his expression grim. "Alara," he said, dismounting and keeping a respectful distance from the porch. "I'm not here to cause trouble. But you have to know what folks are saying." "I can imagine," she said, her voice tight. "They say you're keeping an Apache here. After everything that happened. Alara, they're scared. And they're angry." He sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. "Is it true?" She met his gaze without flinching. "There's a wounded man here. I'm tending to him, that's all." "That's not all, and you know it." Brody countered, his voice pleading. "This isn't just about you anymore. You're inviting trouble not just for yourself, but for the whole town. Send him away. Let him go back to his people. Before this gets out of hand." "He's too weak to travel," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Kyle was getting stronger every day." "Then you're making a choice." The sheriff said, his tone hardening. "And choices have consequences in this part of the world. I can't protect you from the whole town, Alara. Not if they think you've sided with the enemy." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Don't do this. For your father's memory." The mention of her father was a deliberate blow, and it landed hard. But her resolve didn't waver. This was about her father's memory, and her brother's too, in a way the sheriff could never understand. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff," she said, her voice a clear dismissal. He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head, a man defeated. He mounted his horse and rode back toward redemption, leaving Alara standing alone on her porch, the weight of the town's condemnation settling upon her like a shroud. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a siege. In the quiet solitude of the ranch, an unlikely bond began to form, woven from threads of shared silence and cautious curiosity. Alara's defiance of the town had sealed her fate when she poured her energy into Cale's recovery. She taught him her name, and he told her, his voice still rough from disuse. The name meant strong wind in his tongue. It suited him. As his body healed, his spirit slowly uncoiled from the tight knot of mistrust. He would watch her for hours as she went about her chores, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she checked the horizon every morning, the way her hand always rested near the pistol at her hip, the deep sadness that settled in her features when she thought no one was looking. He recognized the armor of a fellow survivor. One afternoon, as she was mending a leather strap, he spoke. "You live with ghosts." It wasn't a question. Alara's hand stilled. She looked up at him, surprised by his directness. "Don't we all?" "Mine walk with me," he said, his gaze distant. "Yours keep you in this cage." He gestured to the valley, to the house, to the invisible walls she had built around herself. His perception was unsettlingly accurate. To deflect, she asked him about his people, the Chiricahua. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, he began to share stories. He didn't speak of war or raids, but of a life woven into the fabric of the land. He told her of the changing woman, of the ceremonies that marked the seasons of the way a hunter would thank the spirit of the deer for giving its life. He described a people of deep faith and complex social bonds, a portrait so contrary to the bloodthirsty savages of town gossip that it chipped away at the foundations of Alara's own long-held beliefs. The hatred she had carried for a decade, a heavy stone in her heart, began to feel less like a righteous burden and more like a poison she had been drinking all along. While this fragile peace grew within the walls of her home, the world outside was closing in. Croft's campaign of intimidation escalated from veiled threats to overt sabotage. One morning, she found the fence to her small pasture cut her 2 horses gone. It took her a full day of tracking to find them miles away, and spooked. A few days later, she woke to the acrid smell of lye. Someone had fouled her well under the cover of darkness. She was forced to haul water from the creek, a back-breaking task that left her exhausted and vulnerable. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were calculated moves designed to break her, to make her life so untenable that Croft's offer would seem like a salvation. Each incident solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for her land anymore. She was fighting against the quiet, creeping tyranny that Croft represented. Her suspicion, sparked by the carved bird and fanned by Croft's relentless pressure, now burned like a low, steady flame. She began to force herself to remember the night of the raid, pushing past the wall of fire and terror to grasp at the details she had suppressed for so long. She sat late into the night, the lamp burning low, her eyes closed, traveling back in time. The attackers. Their faces were painted, yes, but beneath the crude streaks of ochre and charcoal, the skin was pale. She remembered the scent of cheap whiskey on one of them as he ran past her hiding place. A smell she knew well from the town saloon, a scent she had never associated with the local tribes who traded for goods, not liquor. And there was another memory, a sliver of an image that had always felt wrong. One of the raiders had raised his arm to strike her father. For a split second, the firelight had glinted off something on his wrist. Not a leather band or beadwork. It was metal. A silver cufflink on a white shirt sleeve, hastily covered by a hide gauntlet. It was a detail so out of place, so jarringly civilized, amidst the feigned savagery, that her young mind had been unable to process it. Then the most damning piece fell into place. A voice cutting through the chaos. A single barked command as the men set fire to the barn. It wasn't in Apache. It was a word she knew. Now. The command had been shouted in clear, unaccented English. These fragments, these inconsistencies, had been there all along, buried under a decade of grief and accepted lies. She looked over at Kyle, who was watching her, his expression knowing. He had seen the turmoil on her face. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. They weren't your people. He simply nodded his eyes, holding a sorrow as deep as her own. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken words. Alara felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, the truth waiting in the chasm below. She walked over to the small wooden chest, where she kept her few precious belongings. From it, she retrieved the carved bird and held it out to Cale on her open palm. "My brother Ethan made this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me he gave it to an Apache boy he met by the creek. A friend." Kyle looked at the bird, then at her face. The last of his reservations seemed to melt away, replaced by a shared memory of a time before the world had turned to ash. "He was a good boy," Kyle said softly. "He did not see the color of my skin. He saw only another boy. We were going to teach each other our languages." He gently took the bird from her hand, his fingers tracing the smooth lines Ethan's knife had made. I was to bring him a hawk's feather the next day. But the next day never came. "I was there," Alara Kale said, his voice dropping low, heavy with the weight of the confession. "That night. I was hiding in the rocks above the creek, waiting for the moon to rise so I could return to my camp. I saw them coming. I thought they were spirits at first. Their faces were painted for war, But they moved wrong. They smelled wrong. Alara leaned forward, hanging on his every word, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They were white men, he stated the words landing like hammer blows. Shema white men. Their movements were clumsy, not like a warrior who knows the land. They carried rifles, but also hatchets to make the work look like ours. He paused, his eyes closing, as if to shut out the memory. I saw it all. I saw them kill your father. I heard your mother scream. I was a boy too small to fight, too scared to make a sound. All I could do was watch. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, shared grief. Their leader, he continued, his voice hardening, he stood over your father. He was a tall man with a voice like stones grinding together. When he turned to give an order, the firelight caught his face. Kyle looked directly at Alara, his gaze piercing. He had a scar, a thin white line. Here. He drew a finger just above his right eyebrow. The world tilted and went silent. Alara saw not Kyle, but the face of Silas Croft, smiling his charming, false smile. The scar was faint, usually hidden by the brim of his hat, but she had seen it. A dueling scar, he had once called it, a story from his youth back east. A lie. Everything was a lie. The pieces slammed into place with a sickening finality. Croft arriving just after the massacre. Croft knowing exactly which land was most valuable. Croft using the tragedy he himself had orchestrated to seize power and demonize an entire people. He hadn't just tried to buy her land. He had murdered her family for it. The grief that had defined her for a decade was instantly incinerated, replaced by something new, something terrifying in its purity. It was a cold, diamond-hard rage. The ghosts she lived with were no longer just specters of sorrow. They were screaming for vengeance. The fight for her ranch was over. A new war had just begun, a war for justice, and she finally knew the name of her enemy. The rage was a fire in her veins, melting away the last of her fear. She saddled her remaining horse, her movements sharp and precise. Kyle watched her, his expression grim. This is a dangerous path, he warned. He is a powerful man. The town believes his lies. He killed my family, Alara said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, an axiom upon which her world now rested. The town can believe what it wants. I'm going to make him answer for it. She rode into redemption with the fury of the desert wind at her back. The townspeople fell silent as she passed, their faces a mixture of fear and contempt. They saw a traitor riding to her doom. She saw only one face, one target. She found Croft holding court in the saloon, surrounded by his sycophants and hired muscle. The room was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. All conversation died as she stepped through the swinging doors, the harsh afternoon sun silhouetting her in the doorway. Croft, she said, her voice ringing out with unnatural clarity in the sudden silence. He turned, a look of mild surprise on his face that quickly morphed into his familiar, condescending smile. Alara, to what do we owe the pleasure? Have you come to your senses about my offer? I've come to talk about another offer, she said, walking slowly toward his table. The one you made my father 10 years ago. The one he refused. Croft's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. You hired men, she accused, her voice rising with every word, raw and powerful. You dressed them up like savages and sent them to my home. You murdered my family. You murdered my 7-year-old brother. All for a piece of land. A collective gasp went through the saloon. The accusation was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that it hung in the air, like a physical entity. Croft, ever the master performer, threw his head back and laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. "My dear woman," he said, rising to his feet. He addressed the room, his voice filled with sorrowful pity. "You see what I told you. Grief has broken her mind. She has been listening to the lies of the Apache savage she is harboring. He has twisted her sorrow and turned it against the very man who has tried to help this town heal." He turned back to her, his eyes like chips of winter ice. "You are unwell, Alara. You need help, not an audience." "It was you," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "You have a scar above your eye. The leader of the raiders had the same scar." Croft's hand instinctively went to his brow, a fatal tell. His eyes blazed with fury. He had underestimated her. He had thought she was a broken little bird, not a hawk. Just then, the saloon doors swung open again. Kyle stood there, his face set like stone. He had recovered more than Alara realized, and he had followed her fearing exactly this. His presence was all the proof the townsfolk needed. To them, he was the devil, and she was his pawn. Croft seized the opportunity. There he roared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. "The murderer, the butcher of the Cimarron. He has poisoned her mind. Seize him." His men, who had been waiting for the signal, lunged forward. Kyle fought back with a ferocity that stunned them. But he was one man against 6, still weakened from his injuries. They overwhelmed him, binding his hands and dragging him into the street. The townspeople poured out of the buildings, drawn by the commotion. They formed a mob, and their faces twisted with fear and hatred. Croft stood on the saloon steps, his voice booming over the crowd. "This savage is the last of the band that murdered the Cimarron family. He confessed his crimes to this poor, misguided woman, and now we will deliver the justice this town has awaited for 10 years. His eyes found Alara's in the crowd, and they were filled with triumphant malice. He had not only defeated her, he had turned her own truth into the weapon of his victory. Tomorrow at noon, he proclaimed, his voice ringing with false righteousness, "We will hang him in the public square. We will show the world that in redemption, justice will always be served." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Alara stood frozen, watching in horror as they dragged Cale toward the sheriff's office, which also served as the town jail. She was alone, discredited, her only witness, now a condemned prisoner. Croft had checkmated her, using the town's prejudice as his queen. She had charged in with the truth, and he had buried it under a mountain of lies. The morning broke with a malevolent yellow-gray light. A storm was coming. Not the cleansing fury of a thunderstorm, but a dry, choking sandstorm gathering its strength on the eastern horizon. The air was heavy and still charged with an unnatural tension that mirrored the mood in redemption. Alara had not slept. After the disaster in the saloon, she had fled back to the ranch, her mind a maelstrom of despair and fury. Croft had twisted her truth into a noose for Cale's neck. She was beaten. But as she paced the worn floorboards of her father's house, her foot snagged on a loose board near the hearth, a board she had tripped over 100 times. Her father had always meant to fix it. He was a meticulous man, a builder, a record keeper. Everything had its place. Why had he never fixed the floor? A desperate, wild hope ignited within her. She knelt, her fingers prying at the edges of the plank. It came up with a groan of old wood. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool space, was a leather-bound ledger. Her father's hand. She recognized the elegant, precise script instantly. She opened it, her hands trembling. It was a journal of sorts, filled with notes on crops, weather patterns, and ranch finances. But as she flipped through the pages, her eyes caught on entries from the weeks before his death. They were different. The writing was smaller, more urgent, and filled with a strange coded shorthand symbols and numbers mixed with the text. She remembered her father teaching her a simple substitution cipher when she was a girl, a game they played. A is a star, B is a moon. Her mind raced, deciphering the cryptic notes under the growing gloom of the stormlight. And the truth in her father's own words unfurled before her. SC made another offer, insistent. There is more to this than pasture land. He speaks of a rail spur, but his maps are incorrect. The geological survey I conducted shows the pass through his northern property is unstable. The only viable route is through the valley. My valley. Another entry a week later. Discovered SC's investors are a sham company. Traced the funds back to a land speculation firm with a reputation for aggressive acquisitions. He is not a benefactor. He is a predator. He wants this land, and he will not be stopped by legal means. I fear for my family. Have hidden this ledger and a copy of my survey. Brody is a good man, but he is in SC's pocket without knowing it. There it was. The proof, the motive, the entire cold-blooded scheme laid bare in her father's careful hand. Meanwhile, in redemption, Sheriff Brody was nursing a gut full of acid and cheap coffee. Ilara's wild accusations had unsettled him more than he let on. He knew Thomas Cimarron. He was no dreamer. He was a pragmatist, a man of facts. And Croft, for all his polish, there was something cold beneath the surface. Brody had seen it. On a hunch, he had gone through the old dusty files on the Cimarron massacre. The original report was thin-based mostly on the testimony of a grief-stricken Croft, who claimed to have discovered the scene. There was a detail: Brody had forgotten a single spent cartridge case found near the barn. It was from a Sharps rifle. Common enough, but not a weapon favored by the local Apache, who preferred older, lighter Winchesters. It was a small thing, but like a pebble in a shoe, it irritated him, demanding attention. By 11 o'clock, the town had gathered in the main street. The sky was now a swirling vortex of ochre and gray. The wind was picking up whipping dust into stinging clouds that obscured vision and set teeth on edge. A makeshift gallows had been erected, a stark wooden frame against the apocalyptic sky. Kyle stood on a horse, a rough rope around his neck. His face was bruised, but his expression was calm, his gaze fixed on the distant mesas of his homeland. Silas Croft stood before the crowd, a Bible in one hand, his voice a powerful instrument against the rising shriek of the wind. He spoke of justice, of order, of purging the darkness from their community. He was a masterful orator, playing on their fears, validating their hatred, forging them into a single righteous mob. Just as he reached the crescendo of his speech, a lone rider appeared at the end of the street. Ilara. She rode not with the wild fury of the previous day, but with a cold, deliberate calm. In her hand, she held the leather-bound ledger. Croft's men moved to block her, their hands on their pistols. "This is not your concern anymore," Ilara Croft boomed. "Go home." "This has always been my concern," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. She dismounted, holding the ledger up for all to see. "This was my father's." The wind howled, tearing at clothes and hair, forcing people to shield their eyes. The world was dissolving into a maelstrom of sand and sound. "Lies and fantasies," Croft yelled. "The ravings of a madwoman." He gestured to one of his men. "Get the horse." The man moved toward Cale's mount. But before he could reach it, another figure stepped forward. Sheriff Brody. He drew his pistol and aimed it squarely at the man's chest. "Hold on," Brody said, his voice steady despite the chaos. I think we all need to hear what the lady has to say. Croft's face contorted with rage. Brody, you work for me. No, the sheriff said, his gaze unwavering. I work for the law, and the law has some questions for you about Sharp's rifles and fraudulent land surveys. The standoff was absolute. The townsfolk, caught between the two centers of power, looked on in confusion, the sand stinging their faces. Ilara seized the moment. She opened the ledger, and in a loud, clear voice that defied the storm, she read her father's words. She read about the land scheme, the fake investors, and his final chilling entry. I believe Silas Croft means to kill me and take my land. Her father's voice, reaching out from beyond the grave, was more powerful than any accusation she could have made. The truth, tangible and written in a trusted man's hand, shattered Croft's credibility. The whispers in the crowd changed from anger to doubt. Exposed a cornered animal. Croft dropped all pretense. He drew his own pistol with lightning speed. She's a liar, he screamed, but his eyes were wild with panic. He fired at Ilara. In the swirling dust, chaos erupted. Brody returned fire. Ilara dove for cover, drawing her own weapon. The shootout was a confused, terrifying affair, fought in a blinding world of sand and wind. Shots rang out, muffled by the storm. Figures appeared and disappeared like phantoms in the gale. Ilara fought with a survivor's instinct, not for revenge, but for the truth. She saw Croft using a water trough for cover, trying to get a clear shot at Brody. With a steady hand, she aimed and fired. The shot struck Croft in the shoulder, sending him staggering back with a cry of pain. His men, seeing their leader fall and the sheriff against them, lost their nerve. Some fled into the storm, others threw down their guns. The fight was over. As quickly as it had begun, the storm's fury peaked and then began to subside. The wind's scream softened to a mournful sigh, and the thick clouds of dust started to settle, revealing the aftermath. Silas Croft lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his fine suit covered in mud and blood. His remaining men stood with their hands raised, Brody's pistol trained on them. The townspeople were statues of dirt and shock, their faces caked with grime, their eyes wide with the dawning horrific understanding of how thoroughly they had been deceived. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise of the storm. It was a silence of collective shame. Ilara walked over to Cale, who had remained on the horse throughout the ordeal, a still point in the turning world. She pulled out a knife and with a single decisive stroke cut the rope from his neck. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a decade of pain, misunderstanding, and loss was acknowledged. They were not Apache and white, not rescuer and victim. They were two survivors of the same fire, finally standing in the ashes together. Sheriff Brody, his face a grim mask of dust, hauled Croft to his feet. Silas Croft, he said, his voice resonating with the formal weight of the law he had finally chosen to uphold. You are under arrest for the murders of Thomas Mary and Ethan Cimarron. He didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow emptiness of a man whose entire world, built on a foundation of lies, had just crumbled into dust. As Brody led him and his men to the jail, he paused beside Ilara. I am sorry, Ilara. He said the words simple, but carrying the immense weight of his and the town's failure. Your father, he was the best of us. We should have listened. Ilara merely nodded, too weary for words. She watched as the dust continued to settle, the sun breaking through the haze, casting long, clean shadows down the main street of Redemption. The storm was over. The fever had broken, and in the quiet aftermath, the slow, painful work of healing could begin. Months passed. The fierce Arizona sun baked the memory of the sandstorm from the land, and the valley bloomed with the vibrant, tenacious life of spring. Redemption was changing. The railroad did come, but it came honestly following the revised route laid out in Thomas Cimarron's survey. Silas Croft and his men were tried and sentenced, their crimes a dark stain on the town's history, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers. Ilara did not sell her land. The Cimarron Ranch, once her prison of grief, had become a symbol of resilience. With the arrival of the railroad came new opportunities, and Ilara, guided by a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a decade, helped establish a new trading post on her property. It was built on neutral ground, a place where the wagons of settlers and the people of Cale's tribe could meet to trade goods and, more importantly, to trade understanding. She was no longer the haunted recluse on the edge of town. She had become a respected leader, a bridge between two worlds that had for too long been separated by fear and bloodshed. She was her father's daughter, a builder of a different kind of future. One clear, warm afternoon, Ilara walked up the small hill that overlooked the ranch house. 3 simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered by 10 years of sun and wind. Her father, her mother, and Ethan. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer screamed. They whispered, their voices mingling with the gentle breeze that rustled the new leaves on the cottonwood trees. From a small leather pouch at her belt, she took out the carved bird. After Croft's arrest, Cale had stayed for a few days, long enough for his wounds to fully heal. Before he left to rejoin his people, he had pressed the bird back into her hand. "He is yours," he had said. A memory of a friendship that was stronger than their hate. He had then told her the full story, how her small, fearless brother had approached him at the creek, offering a piece of jerky and an endless stream of questions, how they had met in secret for a week, 2 lonely boys from different worlds finding common ground. The bird was a promise of future meetings, a token of a bond that prejudice had tragically cut short. Now Ilara knelt before her brother's grave. The raw, jagged edges of her grief had been worn smooth over time, replaced by a quiet, bittersweet peace. She looked at the small carving in her hand, its wooden form warmed by the sun. It was more than a memory of her brother. It was a symbol of hope, of forgiveness, of a circle finally closed. It represented the truth that had set her free. With a gentle reverence, she placed the small wooden songbird at the base of Ethan's cross. It rested on the earth, its head cocked, as if listening for a new song to begin. Ilara stood wiping a single tear from her cheek. She looked out over the valley, her valley. It was no longer a landscape of ghosts and painful memories. It was a land of promise, green and alive, reaching toward a future she was finally ready to build.